So I begin today to talk a little bit about this idea of loving one's neighbor because of a conversation I had recently with a friend of mine. She was saying, "What is going on with the world? It feels like no one wants to love one another. They all just want to yell at one another." And then she made all kinds of references to stuff that's on social media and on the TV and internet. And I thought, yeah, the world has gone crazy and it can't find its way back to this simple concept. And as we began to talk about it, I began to think about pieces of scripture like Matthew 7:12 that says, "So whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the law of the prophets." Or if you prefer more of an Old Testament feel, forget about the wrongs, things that people have done to you. Don't even try to get even. Love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. That's Leviticus. Holy cow. It's been around for a long time. People don't seem to be able to figure it out. How do we love one another? With that in mind, I started a series now a few weeks ago at Renew, our community meal and discussion time here in Itasca. And to kind of really address this issue, we went to a book that I do with marriage couples, people who come to me to be married. It's called Five Love Languages by Gary Chapman. Great little book, a great understanding that everyone has a different love language, but there are some similarities, and some people weigh more towards one of the love languages than the other. The five love languages that he mentions are words of affirmation, that is, saying something supportive, acts of service, doing something supportive, receiving or giving of gifts, quality time, and of course, physical touch, which we'll get into. It's a whole series. Needed to have a conversation about that. But anyway, so there are these five love languages. I had our Renew group take a survey to figure out which two they are, because there's always a primary one and I believe a secondary one, and they can change over time. There's no doubt about it. It happens. And the first week I talk about words of affirmation, or I'm sorry, the second week of this I talk about words of affirmation, and now this week I'm going to talk about acts of service, that is, doing helpful things. And I want to expand a little bit on that because some people just kind of think of this as one-on-one relationship, but yet if you're really going to love your neighbor, you've got to figure out which love language they are. And acts of service is not a simple one, but for certain folks it's easier to kind of come into an understanding. I do something nice for you, it's an act of love. It's something I do for you, and hoping not to get anything in return. Now, it can be a simple thing like mowing your neighbor's lawn, right? It can be providing a meal. It can be taking their kids to camp. I mean, the list goes on and on and on as loving one's neighbor. Now, I want to make sure you understand, though, that if their love language isn't an act of service, what you're doing for them won't be received in the way it should. And so you've got to be careful, kind of watch the other person and see what they do most often. If it's somebody who sends a lot of cards, it might be receiving of gifts might be their love language. If it's they are always supportive and thankful to you for what you do in the neighborhood, or well, maybe then it's words of affirmation. If they're always coming up to you and kind of shaking your hand or putting their arm around you, it might be physical touch. I don't know. You've got to be careful with these things, though. And so I just want to focus in here. You know, it's not an act of love if you go cut somebody's lawn and they love to cut their lawn. Like they got a riding lawnmower with one of those gadgets in it where they can lift their cup and have a sip while they're mowing the lawn. I mean, there are people who just love to cut the lawn. Moi, no. But some do, and I get that. Then, of course, there are other folks, you know, maybe it's you want to go and do something nice for somebody, so you cook a whole meal for them and you take it over to them, and only to find out they're gluten free. And so cooking that meal isn't an act of service for them. Actually, it's a moment of contention and creates more pain than it's worth. So you've got to be careful. You got to know the person to truly share with them a little bit of love. So it's important to know that other person's love language and to find out what specific things make them feel love. Actions that go above and beyond are the ones that people really do recognize. Um, could be as simple as fertilizing their lawn or going over and doing their dishes. There was a church not too many moons ago that I used to associate with that talked about they always took the new converts to the faith out into the neighborhood and just asked people what they needed done, and they would do it. And I remember a story of somebody saying, well, my bathroom needs to be clean, and the guy said, okay. And the people actually let this gentleman in their house, and he cleaned their bathroom and their toilet. He said it was absolutely disgusting, and took care of it all and would not take money from the guy, and walked away. And when the guy asked, well, why are you doing that? And he says, well, because Jesus so loved you that this is just one way in which I can help you out. It's wonderful. When those things happen and you're an act of service, love language person, it becomes just an absolute moment that you can't stop raving about the person or the activity that the person did for you. Now, there's another caveat to this, and this comes in this way. It should be somewhat spontaneous, you know. It's good to plan an act of service, but also it is good to recognize when somebody is in need and that you put your schedule on hold to serve them. In doing so, you have now said to them, you know what, you're more important than me. Another way to share love is sometimes just to act when the situation seems right. Now, this love language sometimes get a bad reputation in our society because sometimes people say, well, you're just manipulating people. You know, what are you, some kind of narcissist, or are you an abuser or a user? I get that. People whose love languages are acts of service, that is, they receive an act of service as love, they're not someone who's easily abused. They're actually someone who is looking for genuine people who are authentically looking to help you. And they usually have a good sense of self, I guess is the way I put it. Acts of service are assigned by others that they are on your team and willing to lend a hand. The key to ensuring an aspect of relationship that doesn't get out of hand some way, that somebody just doesn't keep saying, well, give, is to communicate. Communicate why you're doing it, what's important to do, and when you're going to stop doing it. I had a friend who, his gift really was to serve others. He actually liked going around to the older people in his community and shoveling their driveway. He did it with a shovel. He didn't do it with a plow. He showed up, shoveled their driveway, made sure they were okay, and then left, never asking for any money. And then it became interesting because there was this one person, this elderly woman, who started treating him as if he was a slave. So when he showed up at her house, she would complain about the edges or what's not getting done. And it became almost an abusive relationship. When finally he came to me and said, I don't think she sees it as love. I think she thinks of it as just something I have to do. And I said, well, did you communicate up front that you were only doing this for a period of time and that this wasn't just an ongoing, every day, every year until you drop dead activity? And he said, well, no, I didn't want her to feel bad. And I said, just because you love someone and show them you love through an act of service doesn't mean they're going to receive it that way. It sounds like she wasn't receiving it that way. Maybe it's time that you let her know you've lent the hand long enough, right? So communicate that. Now, I want to give 2 warnings specifically for acts of service. The first one is this: if you're serving another person with an expectation that they will thank you or return the favor, you aren't serving out of love. You're serving as a transaction. And in such a setting, it's unhealthy, and it sets unhealthy expectations. You see, love is never conditional. The minute you put a condition on love, it can become abusive, and it's not really love. You see, love doesn't keep score. Go to 1 Corinthians 13 if you need to know what love is. If you serve another with the expectation that you're getting something in return, and you stop receiving it, and you start to get resentful, the only person to blame is you. You see, an act of service is something we do out of love. It's a terrible weed in the flower field of love to put in expectations. And it's a weed that's best eradicated by checking one's motives when you love your neighbor. The second warning I want you to hear here is the one I've kind of spoken about it. And here's the words: boundaries, boundaries, boundaries. You need to set boundaries. The key to not falling into a codependent trap of I'm here to serve you at your whim is to set boundaries. Don't expect anyone to be a mind reader. Understand that the person that you're helping may not know all the things about your life, or even why you're helping them, or how long this will take place. You need to be clear. And it's okay to let somebody know, I love you enough to do this for you. Loving one's neighbor, for someone who values acts of service, creates this incredible bond between the giver and the receiver. And it can and does change neighborhoods. There's a great story of Shane Claiborne, an activist, I guess, author, great Christian guy, a little wacky some days, but I just love his love for his community. He moved into a poor neighborhood in Philadelphia, where everything bad could happen was happening in that blighted community. He moved in with a group of people, started what I would call a commune, he'd call a community house, and started realizing there was a food desert in the neighborhood. So he decided to adopt some of the rundown properties where there was just open fields and weeds, and they began to use those as community gardens and feed the people. When people asked him why he was doing it, he said, well, this is my way of serving the community. If there's no food, let's grow it. And then they would serve it through a dinner ministry. And then it would grow to a recovery ministry. And then it would grow to teaching others to grow food. And then it would move into a farmer's market, and people come into the community, and eventually the community would change. You see, acts of service done in love change everything. I hope this was helpful to you. If you're looking for specific ways to show acts of service, online at our website, renew-relationships.org, you can find a listing on that page down towards the bottom of extras. And within that is a great listing of opportunities for acts of service by the 5 Love Languages group, and they call it a symphony of praise. Hopefully that's helpful to you. I look forward to sharing with you next week another language of love.